I walk in the dusty tracks of the Wehrmacht's most powerful division under a scorching sun. The flat landscape is pregnant with ripe crops, wavering gently in a tender breeze. There are no hedgerows, buildings, or people. An unseen road springs from the village of Budovo, but I hear no traffic. There is an intense silence, which helps me to imagine the battle fought here in July 1943. This place is remote. Kursk is 65 miles to the north, and Belgorod 30 miles to the southeast. This open steppe land is unlike anything in England, and like nothing I have seen elsewhere in Europe. It reminds me most of the American Midwest, and feels a long way from home. I look at the sketch map that has been provided for me to help pick out the landmarks. The village of Cherkassky lies shimmering a couple of miles to my left, a shallow ditch to my right. Otherwise, there is nothing but massive fields. I continue northwards and arrive at my destination suddenly, the westernmost tentacle of a 3-mile-long balka. The 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep dried riverbed was used during the battle to house a headquarters, field kitchen, and a small medical aid station. It was a chasm that offered just a little safety as the landscape erupted around it. I negotiate the balka's grassy bank and drop down into the cool air at the bottom. I can hear voices and walk towards them to find Mikhailo Petrik and his son Anton enjoying a joke. Mikhailo was an infantryman during the Battle of Kursk and had been stationed in a dugout not far from here during the opening days of the German offensive. We had met for the first time a week before, and he had mentioned that he was keen to show his son the old battlefield and invited me to join them. We shook hands. Mikhailo's were rough from years spent working as a mechanic near Smolensk. His son's were soft after years spent working as a doctor in London and Moscow. This is where I came to pick up the food for the section the night before the attack, Mikhailo explains. It was full of people, full of activity, but there was tension in the air. We knew that the Germans would strike soon. It was an anxious time. Anton produces a collapsible chair and, declining with a dismissive wave my offer to steady him, Mikhailo slumps into it. He tells us about joining up in Kiev, a crush of people and a forlorn party official taking names. His training? They tried to starve us to death, and his eventual deployment at the front during the battle for Moscow in December 1941, a nightmare spread over weeks. His memory is good, but details are lacking until he comes to describe his DP light machine gun. It fired a 7.62 millimeter round from a Pan magazine perched on top. It was light enough to fire from the hip, but for accuracy we used its bipod. It was a good weapon, but of an old design and was prone to overheating. We fired it in short bursts, but had to be careful not to cook it. Mikhailo proceeds to run through the parts of the weapon in loving detail and dismantles an imaginary DP on his lap and then reassembles it while mumbling to himself. He completes his task with a smile, delighted that he can still remember the process. Anton and I applaud, and he makes a little seated bow. We leave the balka for the position that Mikhailo's platoon occupied on the morning of 5 July. We walk in bursts of a couple of 100 yards to allow our guide to catch his breath. The landscape has changed over the years, he says, as Anton places a baseball cap on his father's balding head. But nothing that blocks the memory. It is all still recognizable. I ask him how many times he had been back to the battlefield since the end of the war. Just once, he replies. I returned in the 1970s with an old comrade who lived in Belgorod and was making a study of the battle. I do not think that he ever finished it. He died many years ago. But the maps that I copied for you are the ones that we drew during that visit. We spent a day wandering around, making sense of the ground and using some information that we collected and some we had been given by others. But are you sure of your bearings now, all these years later? I ask. Oh, yes, Mikhailo shoots back. I spent yesterday out here hunting around. I look at Anton, who is shaking his head with incredulity, and adds with a smile. This is an 86-year-old man who disregards the advice of his physician's son and likes to wander off in the middle of nowhere. We arrive at the edge of a field around half a mile from the balka, towards Cherkassky. Our section was dug in here, Mikhailo announces with authority. The Germans came towards us from that direction. I had been so engaged in conversation that I had failed to relate the ground to the battle as we walked.